Okay, guys, I'm going to kick off. So firstly, thank you for joining this session. So the point of May Wine Month is to try and feature lots of additional education around wine. And in particular with this year, we've got lots of tastings organised with many of our producers and winemakers for wines that feature on the Hotel de Vin core list, as you'll see. Now, I've sent a calendar out already, but there are a couple of additional sessions that I'll be sending out throughout the month. So the important thing about these sessions, in my opinion, is to try and keep them short and sweet. So we feature and fit in lots of small educational sessions throughout the month. So today's session is right back to basics, and we're going to literally do 30 minutes maximum on wine basics, viticulture and vinification. Now, I've got, I think, 4 sessions through the month. Erin, GM of Tunbridge Wells, has got 3 sessions, and then the remaining sessions are being hosted by our various wine producers from around the world. So that's why a couple of sessions are rather obscure times. I know it's not normal for you to be drinking New Zealand Sauvignon at 9:30 in the morning. Well, actually, it might be normal, but you know, I guess for most of you it's not. But because that session is being hosted by the producer of that wine, they are in New Zealand, and therefore the time difference is because of the time difference in New Zealand. So throughout this month, we've got sessions being hosted from South America, North America, around Europe, and both Australia and New Zealand. So the virtual tastings are being hosted by the actual producers of those wines across the world. So this session is really going to be very basic and really a simple introduction to viticulture and vinification, really understanding what those 2 words mean. And hopefully some of what we talk about in today's session with me and in tomorrow's session with Erin will really help when we're listening to the winemakers and the producers when they're talking about the style and approach that those wineries take in terms of their either viticulture or vinification. So today's session, really, we're going to cover the following points. We're just going to look at what is wine and how is it made. We're going to look at where wine is made globally. We're going to touch on viticulture and understand what that word means and how viticulture can impact the end quality of wine that we buy in the bottle and drink from the glass. We're going to talk very briefly about different types of harvest and how that can impact the quality of the wine at the end of the day. And then we're going to touch on vinification and talk about aging. So part of vinification is aging, and we're going to talk about different styles and approaches that winemakers may take when it comes to aging wine before and after release. So guys, this is going to be, like I said, absolute maximum 35 minutes. Feel free to drop questions on the chat if you wish, and I'll try and tackle them at the end. So let's start. So what is wine and how is it made? So firstly, wine is made 100% from grapes. When we talk about notes, characteristics, flavor profiles of wine, so if we're smelling a nice Pinot Noir, we're saying, oh, I get lots of strawberry, or if we're drinking an aged Burgundy, we may say, though, there's leathery notes in the wine. Well, there's no leather or strawberry actually added to these wines. It's just what that note, what that taste reminds us of. So it's the connotation rather than actually things that are added to the wine. So wine is made initially, the recipe for wine, it starts with 100% of raw product, which is grapes. Now there's 2 main types of grapes. There's red grapes and there's white grapes that we use in winemaking. Rosé wine is made predominantly from red grapes, and we'll talk about how rosé is made a bit later, but most rosé wines are made 100% from red grapes. There are some styles of rosé, including champagne, where a red wine can be blended with a wine made from a white grape. So one of the important things here is when we talk about red grapes and white grapes, both these grapes can make white wine. So when we squeeze white grapes and when we squeeze red grapes, the juice that comes out is pretty much the same color. There may be a slight reddy haze in the red grapes, but the actual juice of the two colour of grapes is the same, it's clear. And it's, when we talk about the vinification later, it's the skin contact of the red grape that gives red wine its colour. So whilst there's only two types of wine, there's two types of grapes, red grapes and white grapes, there are hundreds of different varieties that we use for making wine. And some of these on the screen you may know, from Pinot Noir to Merlot to Chardonnay to Malbec to Zinfandel to Riesling. But there are actually over 3,000 grape varieties worldwide that we use for making grapes. And most of the ones that are international now have at some point started their life in one of the old world countries, in particular France, which we'll touch on in a minute. So there's two types of grapes that make wine, that's red grapes and white grapes. But in terms of varieties, there are over 3,000 grape varieties that are used in the winemaking process. So a variety, if we compare it to apples, there's only kind of one key type of apple, but then you've got lots of different varieties. You can buy Katie or a Gala or Granny Smith or a Braeburn, and they're all under the apple category. So it's exactly the same thing when it comes to wine grapes, wine varieties for wine grape growing. So where are wine grapes grown? So essentially all wine growing is pretty much done between 30 and 50 degrees on both the northern and the southern hemisphere. So if we look at the northern hemisphere and the countries that encompasses, it's largely Europe, the United States of America, and just touching on the southern parts of Canada, and then lots of Central Asia. So that's from Iran through to India, the northern tip of India, and a large chunk of Chile and Japan. So they are the northern hemisphere wine growing country. In the south, it's pretty much three key areas. So you've got the southern countries of South America, and that's predominantly four countries. So that's Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. And obviously, the majority of volume from South America comes from Argentina and Chile, and then a smaller volume from Uruguay and Brazil. South Africa, I'm sure Nick will say this is where the best wines of the world come from. It's not true, but that's what he'll say. So South America produce a large amount of wine, and then Australasia. So that's Australia and New Zealand combined is Australasia. And as we probably know, there's a large amount of wine, both in the quantity and the quality categories that come from both New Zealand and Australia. So when we talk about wine growing countries, we tend to sort of talk about two types of country. We talk about old world countries and we talk about new world countries. And there's lots of different elements that are factored into whether a country is an old world or a new world growing country. But the main thing to remember here is that all of the old world growing countries are within the continent of Europe. So that's countries like France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Austria, Switzerland, Germany, and they are old world growing countries. All of the countries outside of Europe are new world growing countries. So that's Argentina, the USA, Australia, China, etc. However, the one catch there is there are some countries in Europe that are classed as new world. And the most obvious one of those is England. And it dates back to a number of different factors, one of which is how long those countries have been growing and making wines. But a lot of the definition between old world and a new world growing wine country is the legal controls and terms that those countries have around grape growing and wine making. So for example, France, which is in Europe, which is an old world wine growing country, has lots and lots of different laws and controls over what you can and can't do in the different appellations. So for example, in Chablis, you are only allowed to grow Chardonnay, and you have to stick to very strict planting methods in terms of distance between vines, pruning restrictions, harvesting restrictions, labeling terms on the bottle, etc. And that's a good example of an old world growing country and the type of laws and restrictions that it has. If you Take that same grape variety to anywhere in the New World. So, for example, Australia. So the same variety, but grown in a New World country. There's no legal restrictions over what that area can or can't do. So a classic area in Australia for growing Chardonnay would be Margaret River, which is down here, just south of Perth. And there's no legal controls over what they can and can't do. So therefore, if they wanted to blend Chardonnay with a little bit of Pinot Noir and class that as, you know, their Margaret River local blend, that they're absolutely permitted to do that. There's a little bit of laws over labelling terms, so they wouldn't be allowed to call it Chardonnay on the bottle if it was 55% Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, for example. But generally speaking, there's very little law and control in the New World wine growing countries around their viticulture and vinification. The Old World countries, as we've said, which are all in Europe, have much more restrictions and controls over viticulture and vinification. So I'll keep using these two words, viticulture and vinification. What do they actually mean? So viticulture, in simplistic terms, is the work that's put in the vineyard. So planting a vine, training that vine, thinning the vine, spraying, grafting, irrigating, and ultimately all the way through to harvesting the grapes from that vine is vinification. So it's all the work that's done outside. It's the farmer's job to produce the viticulture of the work. So viticulture is all the work that's done by the grower to ultimately produce the grapes that then go into the winery and are then turned into wine. Vinification is the process of turning those grapes into wine. So that's the process that's done in the winery itself, and that includes, but is not limited to, destemming, crushing, fermentation, drawing, racking, aging, blending, clarifying, bottling, and there are more. So just to summarize, so viticulture is the work that's done by the farmer to grow the grapes, and there's a lot of work that's done at that stage, all the way through to picking the grapes. And then once the grapes are picked and they move into the winery, the process of winemaking from that point onwards is vinification. There's a sort of classic saying in the wine industry that you can make great wine from great grapes, but you can't make great wine from bad grapes. So it very much requires both whoever's in charge of the viticulture, i.e. the farmer, and whoever's in charge of the vinification, i.e. the winemaker, to work together to produce the best quality wine. You can't make great wine from bad grapes. So a little bit of a deeper dive on viticulture. So the grape growing. So effectively, good quality grape growing is supporting the vine to produce the best quality fruit. And depending on what style of wine that this particular vineyard is making will depend on a lot of factors that are involved, including volume of fruit. So essentially, grape growing vines are a plant, just like any other plant, and they require a number of things to grow. And only once they grow can they produce fruit. And one of the things they require is energy from the sun, and hence the amount of sun that vines need to grow well is linked to the reason why vines are grown typically between 30 and 50 degrees in northern southern hemisphere. They require water, but actually vines are a plant that do well with low amounts of water. So typically something that a farmer, a viticulturalist will look for are plots where the soil doesn't retain too much water, because it's much better for a grape growing vine to be under strain of water than it is to have too much water. Too much water for a grapevine will essentially drown the wine, whereas a limited amount of water will keep that grapevine working and digging for its water, and that keeps the vine healthy and fresh. Other factors that are involved in photosynthesis is carbon dioxide, which is taken from the atmosphere and fixed through the process of photosynthesis. So those of you remember chemistry or biology at school, C6H12O6 plus C6H6H2O. So that's 6 molecules of carbon dioxide combined with 6 molecules of water through the process of photosynthesis, which is the chlorophyll in the green part of the plant, produces C6H12O6, which is glucose, and oxygen. So carbon dioxide is taken in. That carbon dioxide is fixed by the photosynthetic cells in the green part, the green tissue of the plant. And what is produced is sugar and oxygen. So oxygen is released into the atmosphere. And what happens to the sugar? The sugar is stored as fruits, in this case, grapes. So the vine takes in energy from the sun. It takes in nutrients and water from the soils. It fixes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and it produces oxygen and grapes as the fruit, which is where the sugar is stored. Does that all make sense? I think an important part of viticulture is that it's the right balance. It's the right balance of energy, the right balance of sunlight, the right balance of nutrients, and the right balance of water. Plants and grape vines need water to survive, but too much water and they don't become efficient and don't produce good quality grapes. So I don't want to brush over this, but ultimately viticulture is summarized by the production of fruit on the vine, and there's clearly a lot of work that goes into viticulture throughout the year in terms of preparing the vine in its dormant state during the winter and pruning back and getting the vine ready for the next spring and such forth. But it is a year-long workload in the winery. However, the time of year that is clearly the busiest is harvest, and winemakers and viticulturists will work together to decide how they're going to harvest their fruit. And effectively, there's 2 ways to harvest. We can either harvest by machine or we can harvest by hand. And can anyone think of any benefit or reasons why we would harvest by either machine or by hand? A benefit or a negative for either of the 2? Give myself a... You can turn your mic on. Anybody want to throw out a benefit for either machine habit? Oh, okay. Machine is quick. Yep, go on, George.
So machinery, it's faster, we save money, lots of volumes. Hand picking, better quality because we can get rid of the bad grapes, and it's more expensive. And sometimes it's not even impossible to have machinery picking if it's creeks, if the land doesn't really help.
Absolutely. Okay, cool. Also, Laura said to check the grapes properly, it's better by hand. Yep, that's also true. So there's lots of pros and cons between harvesting by hand and harvesting by machine. Damien, Laura, George have all mentioned a number of them there. But in essence, if you need to harvest a large volume of fruit in a short space of time, machine harvesting is often better. And especially, one of the best times to harvest grapefruit, is during the night, because the nights are much cooler and you can pick a large quantity of grape while the grape is still cold and get it into the winery and start that winemaking process while the fruit is still at a low temperature. And it's quite difficult to pick by hand during the night, but it's much easier to harvest by machine during the night. So it's not a case of machine harvesting is always worse and hand harvesting is always better. That's simply not true. There are benefits and negatives to both these harvesting methods. But the biggest benefit to hand harvesting is hand selection. And each person, as they're picking the grapes, can make sure they pick the right quality bunch of grapes and possibly go back and do a second pick. So for example, these guys working in this photo on the right, they may only harvest 50% of that crop in the first pick. They may leave the other 50% of those grapes on the vines to ripen a little further, and then they may come back and do a second pick. So one of the big benefits with the hand harvesting is that it's more selective. And George is right, there's many wine growing regions around the world. The most notable one I can think of is Portugal in the Douro Valley, where you simply can't harvest by machine because the vines are grown on very steep terraces and they rely on walking through the vines. You can't get a tractor through those places. So the biggest benefit with hand harvesting is the selection of the grapes before picking. The biggest benefit of the machine harvesting is that you can harvest a large quantity of fruit in a short space of time and even during the night. The impact that has on the price, price of wine at the end of the day, is typically you're going to be paying a little bit more for a wine that's been harvested by hand, because harvesting by machine is a cheaper way of picking the fruit. So the grapes are picked, they're in containers, and they're shifted from the vineyard into the winery. And that is the process, that is the stepping from viticulture into vinification. So once the grapes are in the containers, the farmer, the viticulturist, has done his work. And once the grapes then move into the winery, it's the job of the winemaker. So the winemaker, or the person that's in charge of the vinification, has lots of different steps that they can follow, from the grapes arriving at the winery, to the bottling of the wine, and therefore the retail and consumption of wine. And I'm going to talk through these steps now, but I'm sort of going to talk through them fairly simplistically. The important thing to note here is that many of the steps along this journey have options depending on the winemaker. So there are lots of different options for juice extraction. We have different types of presses that will give a different result to the juices extracted from the wine, as an example. And each step we go through, every step, literally from 1 to 7, the winemaker has choices. And all those choices will be made based on a combination of their preference for that wine and the price of the end product of the wine once it's made. So the grapes come into the winery, and the first thing they want to do is extract the juice. So if that's a white wine that's not being made with any skin contact, they want to get the juice away from the skins and the stalks and the seeds as quickly as possible and under a low temperature. And then that can start the winemaking process with the juice that's extracted from the white grapes. If it is a red wine, that juice extraction may take a little bit longer. There may be a stage of pressing the grapes first, then extracting the juice later, to allow that skin contact to take place between the fruit and the juice before they start the fermentation. Remember, that's how we get the colouring from a red or a rosé wine. It's that skin contact from the red wines before, typically before fermentation starts. Fermentation, in its principle, is the process of the grapes, the sugar in the grapes, being combined and digested by yeast, which then produces alcohol, carbon dioxide, and heat. So fermentation will pretty much start very shortly after the grapes are harvested, but we then create an environment, which is step 3. We create an environment where we encourage the fermentation to take place. And we do it under a controlled environment. And the reason we do it under a controlled environment is really linked to this heat element at the top. We don't want too much heat in our fermentation because it will ultimately spoil the wine. So during fermentation, the vessel that's chosen for fermentation is often cooled to combat the release of that heat in the fermentation process and keep the wine cooler, which improves the quality of the wine in the day. So we've extracted the juice, we've completed the fermentation, and that has essentially converted the sugars in the grapes to alcohol. So we now have an alcoholic product, but it's what we call a raw wine. So it's a wine that is literally straight out of the grapes. We've made the wine. There's lots of steps that can then go in along the way to produce our quality wine. So if we have made a red wine at this stage, we'll then allow a press to take place where we'll remove the juice from the skins and other bits of pulp and pips and such forth. This pressing or the extract of the wine from the other parts could take place earlier depending on the style of wine. Then there's a stage of filtration, which essentially is removing the clear wine from the other sort of cloudy elements of the product. And this is normally done under a cool environment, so a cold environment. And then we move on to probably the most important part of the winemaking process, which is aging. So aging, we have lots of different options for aging. Can anyone sort of let me know of any any types of aging that may be, any types of vessels that may be used for aging in the winemaking process? Don't be afraid. Some of them are pretty obvious. I'm sure we've heard of them.
Barrels.
Barrels. Thank you, whoever that was. And cast. So yeah, so there's lots of different aging potentials. The first most obvious one is wood. Okay, and wood can come in lots of different forms. Here's two. So the one on the left is huge, kind of 5,000 litre containers from Barolo in Italy. And on the one on the right is a producer in South Australia. So these are small barrels on the right, and these are larger wood barrels on the left. Now, there's wood aging can be used for two things. Firstly, it can be used to impart an additional dimension to the wine from the oak. So notes, sort of smoky notes, leathery notes, vanilla notes, or other sweet spices are impacted into the final product of the wine through that contact with the wood, contact with the oak. And to get the biggest impact in the flavor profile of the wine, we would use smaller oak barrels like this one on the right. Other wood vessels, like this huge wood barrel on the left, are used more to allow micro-oxidation of the wine. So very small amounts of oxygen making contact with the wine and aging and improving the quality of the wine in the barrel before it's then bottled. There are other ways that we can impact wine with wood, but they're kind of would be more of a cheating way. So we use oak staves, oak chips. Sometimes it used to be even oak sawdust, which would then be filtered out of the wine at a later stage. But the sort of main ways of using oak in the aging is small and larger barrels. The next one is concrete. So two different options for concrete here. The photo at the top is a huge concrete vessel. This is the oldest concrete wine vessel in Europe. And at the bottom, we've got some modern concrete eggs. And these are in a producer in northern Argentina, where they're using them to produce a mature Torrontés. So Torrontés is typically a neutral vessel. It doesn't really, unlike wood, it doesn't really provide a different dimension to the wine. But what it does do is it allows the grape to really age and produce different flavor profiles from within the grapes itself. It's also a neutral, like photo on the top right there, it's a neutral storage container. So you can hold large quantities of wine for a large amount of time without the wine faulting or over-oxidating. So it's a good storage container before the wine moves into the next stage. There are other ways of aging wine. It can be done in stainless steel, but that is a completely inert way of aging. And then a wine vessel that's used more and more, especially in Eastern Europe countries like Croatia, is terracotta. So this is at the bottom photo here. This is a winery in Croatia where they're using a lot of terracotta to age wines like Turan, which is a local Croatian varietal. And then the large one, which is really, really important, is in the bottle. So even with many wines, even once they're bottled and sold, they will still age in the bottle. And this is where premium wines, especially premium reds, really take on different characters and different flavor profiles as those wines age over sometimes many centuries, or sorry, many decades of age storing. So 10, 20 years and above, we can really see the wine change its character and its flavor profile over time in the bottle, within the winery itself, like this photo, and obviously in the consumer's cellar or the consumer's house once the wine is sold. So look, that gives us a snapshot in 30 minutes of viticulture and vinification, an overview of grape growing, moving into winemaking. I hope that's been a useful session, but before I finish, I just wondered if anyone had any questions. Okay, well look, this session will be made available by a recording to anyone who would like to watch it later. As I said at the start of the session, the important thing about all the training sessions we're doing this month is to keep them short and sweet. So half an hour sessions covering different sessions, and tomorrow's session is with Erin, and that is on understanding wine terminology. So like I said, today's session, tomorrow's session will really help with some basic foundation knowledge as we move on to the virtual tastings with the wine producers during the rest of this week. So unless anyone has any questions, thank you very much indeed for your time, and I hope that many of you will